Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
During my brother's engagement dinner, while the server slid plates of rosemary chicken and mashed potatoes onto monogram chargers, and the candles threw those flattering shadows that families love to hide inside, my mother leaned close enough that her perfume settled on my tongue and said in that nurse station whisper she uses when she wants to be both kind and controlling, "Don't make this about you." And I nodded because there are battles you pick and there are battles you hold with too. Hands until the knuckles go white, and tonight, at least for the length of one toast and one cake and one slideshow full of baby photos where I am missing from half of them, I thought I could swallow my pride the way everyone keeps telling me I should. I had practiced the quiet version of myself in the mirror earlier, the one who smiles with her molars and keeps sentences short so no one accuses her of lecturing. The one who asks polite questions about floral arrangements and vacation packages, and the merits of an open bar versus drink tickets, and I had promised that version of me a reward afterward. Something simple like a long shower and a glass of wine and the sleep of someone who did not flinch at strategic compliments about the golden child and his unstoppable rise. But it turns out quiet is a costume that fits poorly when your history is sitting on the next chair over, adjusting his cuff links like he invented wrists. And every buzz of conversation includes your name the way a dentist's office includes the faint smell of bleach. Jake looked good, I will give him that. The good kind of nervous that makes men charming, and Lauren was that combination of luminous and brittle you see in brides who have already learned how to smile with a secret tucked under their tongue, and the room. The private back room of a place with framed black and white photographs and a host who knows how to pronounce our last name, hummed with the energy of relatives who arrive early and hold court at the water pitcher as if hydration confers authority, and I floated between tables like a helpful apparition, passing napkins and hearing the same line over and over, "Emily, you must be so proud of your brother." As if pride comes in only one flavor, and it is always served to the person who did the least cooking. I caught my reflection in the brass of a wall sconce and decided I looked like someone who could live through this without leaving fingerprints, and I focused on the little details, the slight wilt at the edge of the bouquets that told me someone cut corners at the florist, the smudge on the projector lens that would make every childhood memory look like it had been filmed through a storm, the box of party favors lined up like tiny soldiers who had been told there was a war, because details are a rope, and if you wrap them around your wrists tight enough you cannot throw anything. The server asked who should take the envelopes, and I smiled and said I would handle the gift table, and there, as if fate were a clerk with excellent timing, I placed my own gift in the front row, a framed 8x10 photograph from the day I graduated. A day my parents missed because their dog had a stomach thing, and they swore they would make it up to me with dinner the following week, a dinner that was later rescheduled indefinitely when Jake landed an interview with a firm that apparently gives out job offers in exchange for family attendance, which is not how it works, but try telling that to people who love a story where sacrifice looks suspiciously like forgetting. I set the frame so the light caught my cap and gown just so. And I slid a simple tag underneath that said, "For the happy couple, may you always make it to the milestones that matter," and if that was petty then I will happily wear the badge, because sometimes revenge should be a small precise cut, nothing flashy, a reminder that bleeding happens before the bandage. Mom noticed the photograph when she came over to adjust the satin ribbon around a stack of cards, and her mouth did that thing where the corners try to climb out of the sentence, and she whispered my name like a warning disguised as affection. And I whispered back that it was a nice picture, which was true, and that I had thought it would look lovely on their future mantle, which was not entirely a lie, because I can picture that mantle so clearly, stockings for holidays I am invited to at the last minute, the kind of spare key they forget to give me, the calendar with everyone's birthdays circled except mine. The slideshow began, and the room softened, and the laughter came on schedule when toddler Jake bit into a crayon, and I sat there folding my napkin into smaller and smaller squares until it looked like a confession, and then Lauren stood, her chair scraping the floor with the sound of a decision, and a hush moved through the room in a clean line, the way a wave lifts a row of boats, and she tapped her glass with a fork, but missed and tapped again, and when that did not work she cleared her throat, and I saw her hands tremble the way a bridge trembles when too many cars try to cross at once. She looked at me first, which surprised me less than it should have, because women recognize each other across crowded rooms the way long-distance runners recognize the shape of a hill. And then she looked at Jake, and then she glanced toward my mother, and she said, in a voice that belonged to someone who has practiced the sentence until the words stopped tasting like blood, that she thought everyone should know the secret he had been hiding, and the fork stopped midair as if the room had been paused by a remote control, and my mother's fingers tightened around my knee under the table hard enough to say, do not move, do not breathe, do not do the thing you always do in emergencies, which is fix them. I wanted to be good, to do what I had promised, to keep my head down and let whatever this was pass over me like weather, but Lauren's eyes stayed on mine as if I were the only person who could confirm gravity, and the strange thing was that my heart did not race. It slowed, and in the space between one beat and the next I understood that my revenge for the night had already happened quietly on the gift table, a little photograph in a simple frame, a truth you have to look at to ignore, and whatever was about to be said would pull more thread than anyone planned, yet there I was, hands folded, napkin a perfect square, as the room leaned forward and the next sentence gathered itself like a storm over warm water, and Lauren opened her mouth and Lauren did not shout or cry or throw the ring the way television trains us to expect. She simply let the words walk out of her mouth in a steady line that landed like a glass set too hard on a delicate table, saying that there were things people in this room deserved to know before they kept telling each other how lucky they were to be here, and that the man everyone was toasting had built certain parts of his ascent on other people's backs in ways that would not survive daylight. Which was the kind of sentence that opens a hatch and drops the air pressure to the point where you hear your own heartbeat as if it belongs to the building. The room did that hushy tremble again. The slideshow froze on my brother at summer camp holding a fish someone else had caught. My mother's hand had already found my knee as if my kneecap kept the ship from rocking, and Jake's smile did that falsifying trick where it asks to be believed while every muscle underneath it is packing a suitcase. He stood and put an arm around her shoulders like a tour guide shepherding a group toward a gift shop nobody asked for, and he said that nerves do funny things, and that this was all a misunderstanding, and that perhaps the excitement had been too much. Which sounded exactly like a man in a suit naming weather patterns while the roof leaks invisible drops, and for a moment I thought she would fold and sit, because that is what our families teach women to do when voices get low and hands get heavy. But she did a braver thing and looked across the room and found me again and said my name, just my first name, as if summoning a witness. And the way people turned their heads toward me would have made a lesser version of myself stand and apologize for the audacity of existing. Yet I stayed perfectly still and counted breaths until the server, who had perhaps worked 100 rooms like this and knew a fault line when he felt one, announced that coffee would be served on the terrace in just a moment, which provided the kind of exit that lets polite people pretend they are not fleeing. Outside, the air carried that expensive smell of tomato vines and cut grass from the landscaping, and the terrace lights made everyone look better than they were, and guests began murmuring comfort in low loops. These things happen. Big nights are emotional. He is under a lot of pressure. She will feel silly later, while Jake performed concern with the precision of a man who has rehearsed how to hold someone by the elbows while not letting her move, and I chose the oldest trick I know, which is to volunteer for a task no one wants so I could slip away, telling my mother I needed to call the bakery about the cake knife that had not arrived, and when she started to say that I should stay put, I simply kissed her cheek and walked off. Because sometimes revenge begins with refusing the role they handed you at birth. I found Lauren in the narrow strip of shadow between the dumpster enclosure and the kitchen door, not crying exactly but breathing like someone pinching off a panic attack with both hands. And when she saw me, she laughed a little humorless laugh and said that it was funny how everyone expects women to either faint or explode when the truth gets heavy, and that she had decided to do neither. And then she reached into that tiny beaded clutch designed by people who think women should travel through life with room for a lipstick and one secret. And she pulled out a plain white envelope that looked like a thank you card until she pressed it into my palm and said very quietly that if I wanted to understand why I lost my job 2 springs ago and who used my name to open doors I did not even know were on the building, I should not open this here, but I should look for the folder called Garden when I got home, and I should be ready for the part that would make me angrier at someone I loved than I thought I could afford. I asked the kind of question that is half statement and half prayer, why me, why now, why like this, and she told me that a person can sit on a secret only so long before it starts scalding. That she had found things by accident while looking for wedding invoices, and had then gone looking on purpose the way a hand goes back to a bruise, and that she had tried to believe Jake's version because believing men has been marketed to us as optimism. But the dates and the forwarding trails and the copied keys did not care about optimism at all, and since everyone in there was so eager to welcome her into the family, they could also stand to meet the story that family tells itself about being good. I tucked the envelope into the lining of my dress where only a sneeze could dislodge it, and I realized with an almost comic clarity that my mother would try to script the rest of the night as a sweet recovery, complete with a makeup toast and a funny anecdote about childhood bath time that erases what had just been said. And in that moment, a very tidy little plan presented itself, because revenge does not always need fireworks when a dimmer switch will do. I stepped back inside, asked the maitre d' for the microphone for a quick housekeeping note, thanked everyone for their patience in a tone bright enough to set teeth on edge, and proposed a toast strictly to transparency, to the kind of love that can survive the lights being left on, to the humbling relief of telling a hard truth before the cake is cut, a toast that sounded benign enough to pass yet carried the precision of a scalpel, because it forced every smiling mouth to decide whether it would drink to honesty while staring at the man they had come to praise. They drank, of course they drank, because people follow the glass when they do not know where to put their eyes, but the room shifted on its axis just a hair, enough that questions began moving through the tables like a draft. And Jake's jaw tightened in that way that means there will be a phone call later scolding me for being dramatic, and I felt a cool, clean satisfaction settle on my ribs, because I had turned the social temperature up by 1 quiet degree, and there is nothing like a gentle boil to prove who can stand the heat, and as I stepped away I sent the group photo from my graduation to the extended family chat with a breezy caption about how wedding season reminds us of all the ceremonies we show up for. A tiny barb dressed as nostalgia that would prick my mother's conscience each time a cousin replied with heart reactions, and we wish we had been there, and it was petty, and it was perfect, and it made me feel like I had finally stopped apologizing for bleeding. Lauren brushed past me on her way back in, composed again in that way women learn to be when they decide to walk through a room instead of around it. And as she passed she said, without looking at me, that whatever I found under that file name would not only answer my question about the past, but would also raise a new one about how long my mother had known. Which was the kind of sentence that feels like someone has cracked a window in winter, and I watched her slide back to his side with a smile that offered nothing, while my mother started toward me with that practiced serene face she uses for funerals and high holidays, and I slipped the microphone to the maitre d' as if it were now hot stone, because the night had turned, and my father was asking the band to play something cheerful, and I had a secret breathing against my ribs and a choice to make about whether to open it before midnight or wait until morning, and then my phone vibrated in my hand with a message from an unknown number that said only, "Do not trust the version she will give you," and I looked up to see Jake watching me from across the room with that same suitcase smile, and the candles shivered as if the building had taken a breath and decided to listen. I did not drive home so much as steer a moving confession through familiar streets that looked suddenly staged, because once a sentence like the one Lauren sent into the room is spoken aloud, everything ordinary acquires an outline drawn in darker ink. And the stoplights seemed to hold me in place just long enough to make sure I knew that nothing about tonight could be walked back with pleasantries and leftover cake. By the time I let myself into my apartment, which has never looked more like a refuge built from clearance furniture and stubbornness, the envelope felt heavier than paper has a right to feel, and I stood in the kitchen with the overhead light buzzing like a small bad idea while I slid a butter knife under the flap. because the part of me that still craves ceremony demanded at least a gesture to mark the opening of something that would change the chemistry of the air. Inside was not a letter, not a melodramatic stack of glossy photos, but a plain black flash drive taped to an index card on which she had written in neat teacherly print a single word, garden, a word that, innocuous as it was, made my scalp tighten because I remembered that the shared drive at my old firm had a folder with that exact name where we parked low-risk assets and cheerful client decks, a folder I had used like a hallway, not a vault, the kind of space where you leave a mug because you will be back in 5 minutes. I plugged the drive into my laptop with the guilty care of someone offering her own pulse to a stranger, and the screen bloomed with a tidy file tree whose logic made my teeth ache. Because whoever compiled this had not only the facts, but the kind of taste for structure that suggests long practice at cleaning up messes made by other people. The folder labeled Garden opened to reveal subfolders with titles that smiled as they cut, names like Holiday and Errands and Miscellaneous, and inside those were copies of emails I had sent and received during the months before the investigation that ended my job, except the threads were arranged in parallel with attachments that had never been there. Screen captures of permission screens bearing my username, time-stamped logins at hours when I had been asleep, and forwarding chains that sent documents to a personal address registered to an alias that, when I sounded it out, formed my brother's initials tucked into a childhood nickname only our family would recognize, and in that moment the floor heaved under me not with surprise. Because somewhere in the unlit corridors of myself I had always suspected that the storm had not been weather, but a man with a hose, but with the relief that comes when a doctor finally says the scary word you have been dodging in exchange for a plan that does not insult your intelligence. I clicked open a spreadsheet titled Gate, and in it were access logs that looked as dull as a brick until you noticed the pattern. The recurring appearances of my credentials immediately after I had used the restroom keycard at the office or joined a client call, which told me that someone had shadowed my routine closely enough to learn when I would be away from my desk long enough to borrow my identity like a code, and there, tucked into the notes column, were abbreviations I recognized from the internal help desk tickets my brother used to ask me about when he claimed he was curious about office life. And suddenly a memory surfaced of a family barbecue where he had charmed my colleagues with jokes about cyber ninjas while my laptop sat open on the kitchen island under a bowl of cherries. And I felt a white-hot mixture of rage and humiliation take my face in both hands. I scrolled further and found a folder called Mom, which, against any reasonable hope, contained a single voicemail transcription from my mother to my brother, a purr of reassurance that she had smoothed it out with the recruiter, and that Emily is strong enough to take a little career turbulence. Words that tried hard to sound maternal while stepping lightly over my lungs. I did not cry, because the body has other ways to evacuate grief, and instead I poured myself the kind of drink you measure with the wrist, sat down, and opened a window in my browser I had bookmarked and never expected to use. The anonymous ethics hotline for my old firm's external counsel, a portal with so many disclaimers it almost convinces you to close it, and into the fields I fed a careful, verified packet drawn from the drive, restricted to the pieces that proved misuse of my credentials and the routing of confidential material to a non-cleared personal account, and I added only one small miracle of context. The message that this packet was not the only copy and that it would be posted to a private link accessible to counsel only if, and when I received confirmation that the prior internal investigation would be reopened under independent review. When I clicked submit, the screen congratulated me with the emptiest thanks I have ever read, but my body unclenched a notch because this was revenge shaped like hygiene, not spectacle, and I trust clean processes more than I trust speeches. With the adrenaline cooling into a focused hum, I drafted another, quieter move, because each night deserves its own small blade. I scheduled an email from a throwaway address to the head of alumni relations at our college, the same man who had once told me that the institution prided itself on ethical leaders, attaching a redacted page from the spreadsheet and asking, as a concerned graduate, whether the keynote speaker they had booked for the upcoming leadership breakfast still met the Standard they liked to brag about in every glossy brochure. An email timed to land at 8 on Monday morning when calendars bloom with goodwill and coffee has not yet made anyone mean. A nudge subtle enough to be deniable and sharp enough to draw attention to the exact soft flesh my family cares about most, which is reputation dressed as legacy. I sat back, listened to the refrigerator cycle on, and only then did I allow myself to feel the tremor of the text from the unknown number that had arrived as I left the restaurant, a message warning me not to trust the version she will give you, which read like my brother's voice speaking through a clenched jaw, and although I wanted to toss the phone across the room, I instead typed a short reply that said simply that whoever he thought I was depended on conversations held in rooms where I had not been invited, and that tonight had changed the RSVP list permanently. Before I could decide whether that was too theatrical, my laptop chimed with a new message from a name I did not recognize. A burner account with a single line and a link that resolved to a cloud folder labeled with a date and the word doc, and inside it, waiting with the pristine patience of digital evidence, was a video file of a security camera pointed at a shared office kitchen. My brother's silhouette bending over a laptop that looked exactly like mine, the timestamp syncing with one of the entries on the gate spreadsheet, and as I pressed play and watched the shadowed shape of his hand slide across a keyboard, I forgot to breathe until the screen froze. Because just before the video ended, another figure walked into frame and set a bowl of cherries on the counter, a figure whose bracelet flashed in the light in a way I knew like my own name, and the drink in my hand tasted suddenly of metal as I paused the frame and leaned in, because the bracelet was my mother's, and the doorbell rang with the steady insistence of someone who thinks he can still talk his way through anything. The doorbell kept ringing with that patient insistence that belongs to people who believe the threshold is an old agreement that will always open for them. And when I finally unlatched the chain and pulled the door wide, I found Jake on the mat balancing apology and authority in the same practiced posture. The kind of stance that says we are going to manage this optics situation like reasonable adults while his eyes calculate which lever to pull first, and he started talking before the hello landed, telling me that emotions had run hot and that Lauren was fragile and that none of this needed to grow teeth, while I stepped back just enough to draw him inside and press the voice memo icon on my phone with the same casual movement I used to silence alarms. Because if there is one thing I have learned from men who call themselves problem solvers, it is that they only confess in rooms they think are private, and you cannot file a truth without a timestamp. He walked the apartment the way a buyer walks a listing he already owns, adjusting frames and asking after my neighbors and suggesting we coordinate a simple statement to the family before rumors took on a life of their own. And when I asked him, with the softness that makes men underestimate, why the folder on the drive used our old shared joke as an alias, and why the access logs seemed to believe I was nocturnal, he smiled the way men smile at airport kiosks and said computers get things wrong all the time, a sentence that might have worked on someone who still believed that smoke rises only because fire is arrogant, and it was then that I opened my laptop to the paused video. The one from the office kitchen with the bowl of cherries and the bracelet that flashed like a lighthouse, and I watched the exact moment his features rearranged themselves from confidence into recognition. The split-second flinch that tells you a person can see the shape of his own shadow, after which he began. The careful dance of explanations, poor lighting, misleading angles, a prank, you know how these things spiral, until I paused him with a raised hand and told him that he had exactly one honest sentence left before I made choices he could not unmake. He used it to say my mother had only been trying to help, which, if you have ever been a daughter in a family that alchemizes favoritism into tradition, you know is not a sentence but a performance. And while he was still stringing together phrases about protecting futures and family names and opportunities that arrive only once, I texted Lauren a single photograph of the bracelet gleaming under fluorescent office light, and I followed it with the file path to garden, and then, because a quiet blade deserves a second edge, I sent a calendar invite to my parents and to 3 aunts who cannot keep a secret without getting hives, an innocuous request titled Slideshow Review, with the venue's email in BCC and a link to a folder of childhood images where, tucked between Halloween costumes and soccer trophies, sat a 3-slide insert labeled Practice Run. Each slide a single screenshot drawn from the logs with my name in the corner and his alias glowing like a sign over a door. The kind of insert that looks like a tech glitch until it is exactly on the screen where wedding candles reflect. He did not see the invites go, because he had finally noticed the voice memo running on the table and lunged for the phone with a brother's entitlement that assumes shared ownership over anything within arm's reach. And in that clumsy move he said the only true words he would offer me that night, which were that he had needed the client materials and that I was not using them, a confession so efficient in its cruelty that it made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was the cleanest summary of our sibling history I had ever heard, and when he asked, a little breathless now, what I wanted, I told him that what I wanted had already started moving on its own calendar, an independent review at the firm, a quiet reconsideration at our alma mater, and a family watching a slideshow that refused to let my face disappear from its narrative. 2 weeks later, the engagement party arrived wrapped in rented fabric and curated lighting, a tableau that would have been beautiful if it had not been so desperate to be believed, and I walked in uninvited but not unexpected. Because once older sisters decide to stop apologizing, they become weather systems, and I could feel the barometric pressure drop as Jake spotted me across the room and measured the radius of the damage, while my mother floated toward me with that expression she saves for funerals and fundraising, her mouth already forming the phrase, "Let us be gracious," which might have worked if graciousness had not been the first sacrifice on the family altar years ago when my success was measured in how quietly I could stand beside his. I kissed her cheek, admired the centerpieces, and asked without changing tone whether the AV team had triple-checked the slideshow, because nothing ruins a night like a frozen frame, and I watched a thin wire of panic pull her eyebrows together as she excused herself to speak with the coordinator, which told me that the invite had done its work and that the room was primed for honesty whether it knew it or not. When my turn to toast arrived, because of course they handed me a microphone, believing that the older sister would smooth the waters if you named the role correctly, I thanked the hosts and the planners and the families who raised 2 people to be brave enough to promise the truth in public, and then I told a small, polished story about learning to ride a bike behind our old house on a street that sloped more than it seemed. A story about skinned knees and helmets and a brother who let go of the seat before I was ready, which earned exactly the kind of tender laughter that makes an audience open its throat, and as the last chuckle settled I nodded at the tech and the screen behind us swapped from baby bath time to a simple white slide with the words, "Practice Run," followed by a quiet cascade of 3 images that contained no blood and no commentary, only timestamps and login names and a familiar alias that spelled itself even for the cousins in the back, and the noise the room made was not a gasp so much as a recalibration, the soft clatter of cutlery laid down by people who suddenly realize their hands are not empty after all. I did not raise my voice or name my brother or demand an apology, because real revenge is the absence of negotiation, so I drank the rest of my champagne and left the microphone where it could be found by anyone with something honest to say. And as I stepped off the small riser, Lauren drifted close, carrying that unflappable stillness women learn when they have rehearsed their exit, and with a smile that did not belong to the room she leaned toward my ear and told me that I had done a neat job of sweeping one corner, but that the house had more rooms than I had walked, and that if I wanted the full blueprint I should check a subfolder named Nursery before the weekend ended. After which she pressed a place card into my palm with a key code written on the back and moved toward my brother, whose smile had become a tourniquet. And I stood there with the card warming in my hand while my phone vibrated with a new email from the firm's counsel marked urgent, and the band, not knowing what to do with the silence that follows a truth, struck up something cheerful as the screen froze on the bracelet that flashed like a lighthouse, and my mother, who has always believed ambience can drown a storm, looked at me with something almost like recognition as the lights flickered and the room made up its mind to listen. After the party dissolved into that brittle hum of small talk people use to build bridges over wreckage, I drove without speaking, the steering wheel slick with champagne residue and adrenaline. And when I reached home I sat in the driveway with the engine running, because silence can feel too much like an accusation. The night outside looked domesticated, one of those careful suburban nights where nothing seems capable of betrayal, yet the place card with the code Lauren had pressed into my palm seemed to radiate heat through my coat pocket as if it contained an animal heartbeat. I carried it inside, laid it on the table beside the cooling laptop, and typed the code into the shared drive link she had scrawled on its back, and for a long moment nothing appeared except the slow bloom of a folder marked nursery. A word so disarming that I almost laughed, because I was tired of metaphors that pretended to be harmless. Inside were photographs, crisp and recent, taken in an apartment that looked nothing like theirs, all sunlight and houseplants and a crib half assembled in the corner, its instruction manual splayed open on the floor beside a coffee cup with lipstick on the rim. The next file was a receipt from a private clinic, dated 2 months earlier, and beneath it a sonogram labeled with a patient ID that did not match Lauren's, and the reality of what I was looking at assembled itself with a slow, sick precision, piece by piece, until I realized that the woman in the photos was someone else entirely, a coworker from Jake's firm, a name I remembered because I had seen her once at a holiday event years ago, the kind of effortlessly polished woman who turns compliments into weapons by pretending not to notice them. It took another minute for the arithmetic to settle. Lauren had known, had waited, had fed me breadcrumbs not out of sisterly solidarity, but because she wanted to detonate the story in increments, each explosion calibrated to take out one more pillar of his facade. I scrolled through the final document in the folder, a draft of an email Lauren had written to his firm's HR department and never sent, outlining a timeline of deceit that stretched back to the first months of their engagement. Noting meetings that were not meetings and invoices that disguised flights, an email that stopped mid-sentence with a line that read, "The truth is contagious, and I am not immune," before cutting off like a transmission interrupted. For a long time I simply stared at that unfinished line, because it felt like a mirror held up to every version of myself that had tried to stay decent while walking through other people's smoke. The quiet around me became unbearable, and when I heard the faint vibration of my phone on the counter, I almost ignored it. But habit is a cruel muscle. I looked, expecting another half-hearted apology from my mother or a family group chat spiraling into damage control, but the message came from an unknown number and contained only 4 words: "He's asking about you." I knew, without logic, that it was Lauren, and the phrasing carried a strange calm, as if she were warning me, or passing the torch, or perhaps just ensuring I understood that Jake's story was not over, that exposure was not the same as extinction. I sat there until the sky lightened, watching the color bleed slowly into the world outside my window, and thought about how endings are only endings if someone chooses to stop telling the story. When my phone rang again at dawn, it was my mother, her voice hoarse and ragged around words that tried to dress themselves as care. She said that families survive worse, that public perception could still be managed, that love forgives. I listened, not interrupting until she ran out of script, and then I told her quietly that forgiveness is not the same as amnesia and that I had already sent everything to the people who would know what to do with it. There was a silence so deep I could hear her swallow, and then the line went dead, leaving me with the ordinary morning sounds of birds and garbage trucks, proof that the world keeps rehearsing normal even when the cast has changed. By afternoon, the story had started to move through the city's gossip arteries, reshaping itself as stories do when filtered through curiosity instead of context. A former colleague called to tell me that Jake's access badge had been deactivated, that his name had disappeared from the firm's website, and that there was talk of a temporary sabbatical for personal matters. The phrase made me laugh out loud, a rough sound that startled even me, because language has always been his favorite disguise, but this time it would not save him. That evening, I sat by the window with the laptop open again, scrolling one last time through the fragments Lauren had left me, and I noticed a small text file I hadn't seen before, hidden among the image thumbnails. Its title was a date, no hint of content, so I opened it expecting notes or metadata, but instead there was just a short paragraph written in her tone, measured and unhurried. "You think revenge is the opposite of love, but it isn't." "It's what?" happens when love rots in silence and finally grows teeth. When you read this, I'll be gone somewhere quiet. He won't look for me. But you, maybe you'll do what I couldn't and stop making apologies sound like peace. I read it 3 times, unsure whether it was a farewell or an instruction, and then, without dramatics, I closed the laptop and set it aside. There was nothing left to expose that wouldn't eventually reveal itself, because truth, once uncontained, has its own itinerary. I walked to the kitchen, made coffee strong enough to taste like resolve, and opened my inbox to find a reply from the firm's external counsel confirming receipt of my documentation and promising an internal review under strict confidentiality. The words were impersonal, almost bureaucratic, yet they landed with the strange grace of closure disguised as procedure. As the day faded, I went for a walk through streets that had been background noise for years and felt, for the first time in months, no need to explain myself to the air. I thought of Lauren somewhere rewriting her life under another name, of my mother retreating into the safety of curated silence, and of Jake learning the texture of consequences without the cushioning of applause. None of it felt like victory. Not exactly. It felt more like equilibrium returning after too long an absence. When I got home, I placed the flash drive, the envelope, and the printed screenshots into a single box, sealed it with brown tape, and wrote nothing on the lid. That night, before sleep came, I typed a single post to my private account, no names, no references, just one sentence that felt like breathing after years underwater. Sometimes silence is louder than confession. Then I turned off the phone, let the dark find its shape around me, and thought, with a kind of steady relief, that maybe the real secret was that I had stopped being afraid of being the one who tells the story last.